Thanks, David. First, I'd like to thank the grandmothers and grandfathers for bringing us safely here so we can share in these ideas. And I'd also like to acknowledge the Musqueam territory. And to me, that means that we have to do our best to respect their governance and their governance in terms of how the lands, how we live in these lands, and how we respect one another. And I'd also like to thank David and the First Nations Studies Department at UBC for inviting me out here to speak, and also you good people for arriving, and all the good people of Green College who've treated me so well. This is like, I feel like, how do you say that? Harry Potter, Hogwarts? Hogwarts? I sort of not got trouble with some words, but anyways, so I sort of feel a bit like that. So it's kind of a magical place. So thank you very much. Appreciate it. But to be honest, I am an interloper. I am not a scholar, even though this is a learned scholar workshop, at least not at this point in my life. That is, I am not like you dear scholars, students and professors, maybe more like a squatter in these hallowed halls. There was a time when I was scholarly, and certainly I consider myself learned, or more to the point, learning. Aboriginal narratives in cyberspace, notes on appropriation, polemics, philosophies, and a story. These are a few words I wrote down more than once until I got it right. But my time is now that of a filmmaker and producer creating such programs as Coyote Science, as David pointed out, and we're just wrapping season 2, and the making of Monkey Beach, my first dramatic feature based on the book Monkey Beach by Eden Robinson, which I'm very honored to be able to turn into a feature film. We wrapped just over a month ago, and yes, I have been working on all of that, so it's hard to sometimes move into this very learned way of looking at the world when basically been barking action for the last month or so. But I really wish I could show you a rough cut, but alas I can't. But what I thought I would do was just to prove that I was really there. I wanted to show you just some fun images, just a few, ones that don't give anything away from the shoot. This is, after the end of the shoot, everyone was kind enough to give me this drum, which they all signed. And we were really lucky because I filmed in Kitimat, the village, the actual place where the book was written. And so I was very honored that there were so many people from the village that were able to work on Monkey Beach, as well as the crew that we brought up there. Here I am with Stephanie Mathias, who's from Squamish. She's the daughter of the late Joe Mathias, who plays the mother, and Grace Dove, who is Lisa, the character from Monkey Beach, amazing actor. Nathaniel Arcand, which I'm sure many of you have seen around from shows like Heartland and Smallville and North of 60. That was after a day of shooting. Here I'm scaring my cinematographer, Sterling Bancroft, who is an amazing cinematographer. This was our last day of shooting, and this is the beach that we're using to pretend to be Monkey Beach, because our budget didn't allow us to actually go film up in Monkey Beach, because that's 2 hours by a fast boat to Monkey Beach, 5 hours by a fishing boat. So, we had looked into bringing everybody up, putting us all up in yachts and fishing camps and stuff like that, but they're all booked. There was nothing available. So we were able to use this beach, which is not too far down from the village. And then, again, more proof. At one point, these are all the dressing rooms, and the people from Kitimat were so patient with us because we showed up with a lot of trucks. And at one point, we had bigwas on the door for the Sasquatch, the Heisler word for Sasquatch. I hope I'm getting it right. So I thought that was kind of cool. I didn't show you that one, and I can't show you him. Some of you later, if you pay me money, I will show you him. I've got him on my phone. But he's actually pretty amazing. He was designed by Carmen Thompson, who is Art Thompson's daughter. And she did an amazing job on creating our Sasquatch. This is us shooting at night. We shot 21 days. It's hard to believe sometimes. I had 120 scenes. So basically we shot about 6 scenes a day, many at night. And then this is the real Monkey Beach at high tide. We did manage to send one, what they call a splinter crew or beat camera up to Monkey Beach to do a little bit of filming. So I was very honored about this. And this is, again, the actual beach we filmed at, which is so beautiful. And then this is our Spotty. How many of you read Monkey Beach? So you know about Spotty. So we had to film Spotty down here because the guy who trains ravens and won't fly with the raven. So we, pardon? Kitimat Village. Kitimat Village? Yeah, yeah. So this is, it's on the ocean, yeah. And so this guy is our Spotty, and he's just, I think he just ordered a drink, but the green screen is over there where we filmed him, and he was not very cooperative. He did a few things, but he's quite the personality, so hopefully it will work out. We might have to do some CG. So anyways, so you see that I'm on many minds, but all of them I always try to bring the same honor, the same philosophy, the same, I feel like 7 teachings of the pipe and Cree teachings. I'll read those out for you for a minute so you can think about them as we go through this, and maybe you can we can decide whether I'm really doing this or not. And the 7 teachings, the health, happiness, generations, which means like life, generosity, compassion, respect, and quietness. Those are the things that make me think about who I am as a storyteller, who I am when I engage with these technologies, what do I bring to this? Do I bring these? Do I honor these? Do I honor them behind the camera, in front of the camera? Do I honor them in my relationships with my crew and the people that I work with? So keep those in mind as we go through. Also, I asked David if he uses my his Aboriginal Narratives in Cyberspace essay, and he said he does. So fortunately, there's not too many of his students here. So, because I'm going to quote from it. It's over 20 years old, so I figure I deserve to be able to quote from myself 20 years later. Has anyone else read that essay? So, okay, cool. So a couple people. So, okay, so you can leave the room if you want while I'm quoting myself, but in any case. Some people say it's a seminal essay, I don't know, but it all came about because this isn't the first time Indigenous people have been talking about cyberspace and virtual reality. Back in the 90s at the Banff Center, where a group of us created the Aboriginal Arts Center, which has sort of morphed into more a performing arts institution, we were doing work around cyberspace and virtual reality. In fact, we held a very large conference called From Drum Beats to Drum Bites, and we were asking what does this technology mean to our lives. There are some artists there who said things like they want nothing to do with it because as soon as something goes up online, that's the end of their copyright. That's the end of their intellectual property, that people are going to steal their image. So they're just going to disengage from it. There were other people. We invited Buffy St. Marie, who was there, and she'd been doing it for Cradleboard forever. She was completely engaged with the internet and saw it as a really useful tool and that is back in the early 90s, for education. And we had people like Roger Ross and John Goldcenter, who had been working in the States using the technology, particularly around land management, trying to get Indigenous communities to realize that not only can they use it as a tool to help manage their resources, they also have to assert their sovereignty over that space, that virtual space. They meant it in some ways just a fiber optic. It was probably before fiber optics, but whatever was carrying those signals, they should have control in the same way that whatever road or river came through their territories. So they were engaged in that discussion then. So this is not a new discussion. This is a discussion that started back in the day. And from that, I wrote Aboriginal Narratives in Cyberspace. So I'm just going to quote a little bit, because I think I need to kind of give some context to where we are now in terms of the IM4 lab, which is a VR lab that I created with a group of Indigenous women matriarchs. And as David said, is the first Indigenous VR lab in Canada. There is the amazing Jason Lewis and his group at Concordia, who is a computer lab, and they're doing VR, and they're doing all kinds of amazing things, Second Life. So I'm not suggesting we're the only ones, and there are certainly other artists who are working in VR. But I think this is the first one that is being created, hopefully within those 7 laws, and also trying to kind of counter some of these things that I'm going to talk about a little bit. So this essay is so old that the book I referenced is from 1991, and it was from a guy named Michael Heim, who wrote the Erotic Ontology of Cyberspace. And he said, cyberspace, and when I say cyberspace, I kind of am using it interchangeable between VR and cyberspace now, but it was cyberspace then. Cyberspace is Platoism as a working product. Here, with an electronic infrastructure, the dream of perfect forms becomes the dream of information. Filtered through the computer matrix, all reality becomes patterns of information. Here, the idea of the universe, as imagined by Plato, takes shape. And if I can kind of add a little two cents worth here from, that wasn't in my original essay, perhaps this symmetry that always is, comes to be, but never really is. And I responded to that his analysis. Perhaps these patterns in cyberspace will be imagined as liquid light, like a neon sign shining slick and menacing by a wet road at midnight. Maybe cyberspace cities will be built as if of crystals that shimmer in the sunless sky. And along the roads and highways of this geography, information will flow like blood in a space where there will be no flesh, and shapes will shift like shadows on the wall. Heim added, propelling humanity to this place, to the perfect form, in eros is eros, to extend our finite being and to see more and to know more deeply. And to do so, eros inspires humans to outrun the drag of the meat, the flesh. In this ontology of cyberspace, hell of Western thought, the tension between the need to know all and the limitations of the body and the senses of the physical world creates a need for a new sight of the heart and mind of man. Well, virtual reality, in a way, is like the mini-me of this whole big cyberspace, a sight for the heart and mind. So cyberspace and VR are somewhat interchangeable in this, but the intelligence, the emotional and mental intelligence that imagines cyberspace is imagining and being applied to virtual reality. In that same essay, I imagined, instead all the universe, so I'm talking from an Indigenous perspective now. Instead, all the universe is endowed with spirit and intelligence from which ideas flow. It's become almost trendy to mention, but in this worldview, there is no separation of body, mind, spirit, and heart. The body is of the spirit, the mind of the heart. I may stretch the credibility of the more scientifically minded, but imagine our view as resembling string theory. All life is connected throughout the universe, yet we are of the earth, responsible for our existence in our territories, responsible for caring about the life around us. Though life is hard, there is joy. The land is the culture, the old people say. In contrast, even opposition to which says the mind is the culture. If you could imagine human consciousness as fractal geometry, then trajectories of Western consciousness would spiral and billow. Here, Eden, Plato, calculus, Descartes, technocracies, and cyberspace are all very much part of the fragmented fractures, self-similar shapes of fractional dimension of Western consciousness. And that was a quote. I'm sorry, I don't know what the last part. I think it's Michael Haim again. What if Aboriginal consciousness was fractalized? Would cyberspace as articulated, or VR articulated, be part of the geometry of our philosophy? Would we have imagined cyberspace? Would we have created cyberspace? I think not if cyberspace is a place to escape the earthly planes and the mess of humanity, and not if it's a place of loss and death, where we are to be reborn inside the machine. And there are points of potential convergence between these. Are there points of potential convergence between these worldviews and cyberspace? The Aboriginal idea that all elements of being, spirit, flesh, sky, and earth, can be inhabited simultaneously without active differentiation may have parallels in the experience of cyberspace. However, the Aboriginal view expresses how all life is interconnected. There is no disconnection from the material world. The transformation that is a regular experience in Native narratives is not like the experience of escapism in Western narrative, nor the disembodiment of cyberspace. And then this led me to say this. Cyberspace will not simply create a new machine, it will fuse human and machine. What then of the world it will create for 7 generations hence? Will there be no need for grandparents? Will travel become minimized so that roads fall into disuse? Will paranoia increase? Will there be need for more or less fluid in the water, fluoride in the water? Will you ever see the moon again? I don't know why I picked those random questions, but it seemed kind of like if we're in cyberspace, if we're in this kind of like, other virtual world, then we don't need roads. Maybe we don't need fluoride because we're not eating sugar all the time, so, we don't have to worry so much about it, But what about the grandparents? Because, the grandparents. What about who needs the grandparents? Who considers the 7th generation when creating space and narratives in cyberspace or VR? What about, there's also a lot of talk back in the 90s about these virtual museums and virtual malls and virtual arcades. There was a lot of talk in the 90s about cyberspace as this kind of bachelor place. I don't think you hear that nowadays so much, but it still is. It's very much a bachelor place. Why are these institutions recreated in cyberspace when cyberspace is supposedly heralding a world of anarchy or democracy, depending on the age of the heralder? What will the consequences for future generations be of internalizing the power relations of that these virtual spaces are created? What change will occur in their sense of freedom, their free will, as the power relationship between those who own information and those who access it remains much as it does today, or perhaps even regresses to feudal ways, which I think is kind of what's happening right now, it seems to me, 20 years later. Hey, I was predicting. I was predicting. Information is experienced in space and time in a place beyond space and time will no doubt change consciousness. So now I'm just going to kind of wrap that up before I get into some other discussions to bring us 20 years forward. I just want to reference Berger and Benjamin, which I don't think are current hip references anymore, right? Shows you how, you know, non-scholarly I am. But what I liked about Berger especially is how plain spoken he is, or was. And to me, that's one of the approaches I've taken since I used to. I've written a few essays that are like as theoretical as anybody, but I decided at some point, no, I'm going to be plain spoken. It was a choice I made, and I made it in consciously, but after interaction with a dear late friend of mine, Vera Manuel, who does that. She said, no, I write for the people. And so she gave up that theoretical and chose to speak plain spoken. So I try that as much in my work now, and which may be why I was drawn to Berger back in the day. Anyways, Berger explains that very few stories are narrated, whether to idealize or to condemn. Rather, they testify to the always slightly surprising range of the possible. Although conceived with everyday events, they are mystery stories. And then Benjamin compared storytelling with the novel and concluded that in storytelling, the most extraordinary things are related with the greatest accuracy, but the psychological connections of the events are not forced on the listener. It is left up to him to interpret things the way he understands them. In Indigenous VR and narrative, you are invited into the mystery of the everyday and of the everywhere. You must define yourself in relationship to the story around you. You are not witness to the ethnographic containment, where in the gathering of data you become a hero. Instead, you are challenged to portray yourself, to make your own psychological connection, since you are your own author. Which leads me to the IM4 lab. But not exactly. I'm almost there. But in the IM4 lab, this fractalized imaginings, dreams, logging, fears, social needs, whispers and shouts in many languages, resistance and wounds, bright eyes and tricksters may exist. So to go back to the time when we were writing this, when I was writing this, there was a panel that was organized that was part of Cybercom 4, which was something that they used to have back in the day, and one of them was held at Banff. It had all these very learned people who were very active in what was going on in the early 90s around VR, around the theoretical discussions about cyberspace. I looked online to see if there was any archive of that event at Banff, and so far I haven't been able to find it. But in any case, there was an amazing amount of people there, and I organized the conference, one of the panels with Dr. Leroy Littlebear and the late Ahasu. And Dr. Leroy Littlebear, who many of you know, I'm sure, for his brilliance, he said, we don't need cyberspace. We don't need virtual reality. We already have it. He says, we go out on the land and we fast. And in the fast, our body experiences that relationship to the energy that surrounds us, that is this universe. I don't know how many of you, I think Vine Deloria is sometimes not necessarily well liked by certain academics. Particularly, I understand, particularly, anyways, I love him. And he talks about a personal relationship to the universe. And Leroy Little Bear was basically saying that too, that this personal relationship with the universe. And the other thing that Leroy said was language. He said that if you really want to experience beyond this physical world, beyond sense of time and space, then learn an indigenous language. Because in an indigenous language, you will be experiencing time and space differently, animate, inanimate, differently, gender differently, and it will transform it will rewire your brain. He was very open about it. He didn't try to, is that me? Oh, I know, and it's my glasses, sorry. He's always been very proactive about it. He worked with a group of quantum physicists for 10 years at MIT and other places, people like David Peat and Bohm, I always think I get his name wrong, B-O-H-M. And they talked about these things, and elders and him and these quantum physicists came together, and he challenged those guys to speak a language, to learn a language, any language, he said. Fortunately, none of them did. And unfortunately, I'm still not fluent in my language, although I try to do best I can. Anyways, he said, learn another language, and that will help transform that relationship, or perhaps break that thing that Western culture so wants to break. So, I want to kind of just throw a couple little things before I get into the IM4 lab. So 20 years later, we're now in the thralls, and now we're kind of like the promise of Eros in cyberspace has come somewhere else. And again, to prove that I am not a scholar, but an interloper, I read Wired magazine this month. Wired, I used to read it all the time, but it became kind of, it changed. It became more like a catalog to sell things, but now it's kind of gone back to sort of its originals, so it has a lot of good essays. Yeah. I think it's banging my hair. Not my hair, it's banging my glasses I have around my hair. Around here. I'll put it up here. Okay. Anyways, in this article called Hyperinflation Isn't Just a Pox on Currency, the writer Virginia Heffernan talks about extreme inflation of Weimar Germany, which led to a crisis of meaning. What did money mean when it meant nothing or bought nothing? And the hyperinflation and the collapse of economies and the march of fascism, she ponders that this relationship, this fever that destroyed currencies, also collapses values. Then, is it possible that digitization complicates the relationship between tokens of value and material value? That money and language are both symbolic systems for assigning and measuring values. And beginning in 2004, she says, terabytes upon terabytes of information have poured into circulation like wooden nickels, and evidence of social disintegration in many who are vulnerable to the disinformation, and perhaps, I may add, fascism. To Heffernan, this has resulted in what she calls a trauma. And so then she talks about how, as a consequence of this, you see this kind of like rhetoric coming out of people like Trump, who talk about blood and soil and purity. This idea that there is no more meaning to truth, to this terabytes of information that everybody, so they retreat. So his followers retreat into the language of blood and killing and race and purity, and how that is a consequence of this thing. So, to go back to us 20 years ago, when we were saying, can we bring these different values into this place? Could we have forestartled that? Could we have seen a different type of cyberspace? Could we have seen a different type of VR? Or whatever kind of technology that would have come to be from that. So that's, really at the heart of why I created the IM4 Lab. So the IM4 Lab is a very fledgling little space. I woke up one day and I saw that there was virtual reality being commissioned by some very remarkable artists in the Indigenous community. But I sort of felt like, here we go again. We're going to have the same economy, the same eros. We're going to have the same sort of philosophy driving this. The people will have an opportunity to see their stories and have the opportunity to create work, but it's not going to be transformative. Nothing's going to change. And in fact, could we potentially just become, everybody, as I used to say, you guys are too young, most of you remember this, but they used to say roadkill on the what did they call that? They used to call it roadkill on the information highway. Yes, that was what they used to say. Yes, yes. So I looked around and I said, I'm of two minds. I have this sort of practical mind because I'm a producer, and I'm also this sort of intellectual, hopefully somewhat spiritual person who said, okay, this is maybe the first time we can actually do something about it. We tried it back in the 90s, but nothing really happened, not just for us. In general, in the art community, the virtual reality that was around, the kind of the interventions into cyberspace were very intellectual, were very were very intellectual, but they kind of dissipated. .coms failed, the whole stuff failed, so there was a whole different trajectory that went on. Technology had to catch up, investors had to catch up. So now here we are with this promise of virtual reality going to basically transform how we learn, how we work, how we interact, how we create economies, how we exist, So I decided, is it there a way that a group of Indigenous matriarchs, in this case, C. Swice, Doreen Manuel, Tracy Bono, Amethyst First Writer, and myself, who are what I see, what I guess academics used to call organic intellectuals, but who are very learned in their own cultures and certainly have master's degrees, but who have been active in transforming their communities, using technologies, using their art to basically create those, bring those principles, those values into what Barry Barclay would call the marketplace. So we as Native people, when we go out into the world, we are going out into a marketplace, whether we like it or not. When we go through galleries, when we go into museums, when we go into film festivals, when we go into even places like this, in the sense it's a marketplace. And so this is a challenge for all of us because in a way that was not our relationship to our knowledge, to our exchange of knowledge, to our ideas, a marketplace in the way that it's imagined. So what can we do? Can we counter that? What can we do? Can we create something different? So this is my fledgling effort at doing that. The idea being, from a practical point of view, the Indigenous, this is the first time ever, we could kind of roughly be at the beginning of a major technological transformation. And like everything else, we're still playing catch up. We're still playing catch up. It's taken me over 10 years to make Monkey Beach. Because when I started, 10 years ago, Indigenous women can't make feature films. Now there's a lot more opportunity, but 10 years ago, that wasn't the space. There was no space for that. Just doggedly never gave up. So can we, at this very moment, can we drive the creating of an Indigenous VR industry that reflects, in my case, those 7 pipe lessons? In the case of Jury Manual, it would be coming from her traditions and her history, from Cease, from her traditions, and from Amethyst First Rider, who is Leroy Littlebear's wife, and from Tracy Bono, all bringing unique philosophical and cultural ideas, also having spent most of our careers giving back, being part of something in which we are giving back. So that was important to me to create. I'm going to show you a little bit of our pitch pack that we created to try to raise money. By the way, I have raised money. I raised a Western Diversification grant to the total of 1.5 million. And then we recently got a Congress of Aboriginal people gave us, about 80,000, and TELUS has been very supportive as well. So this tells you a little bit about IM4. And again, because the other thing is that we've often not been able to do is we talked about the 7 things: generosity, generations, livelihood, to be able to support our families, to be able to make a living. I know it's very hard for artists in general to make a living, filmmakers in general to make a living, but I can assure you 75% of Indigenous artists and filmmakers and poets and writers are probably well below the poverty line, including me. Although things are okay right now, but next year I could be back to the same boat. So can we participate? Can we create an economy? Can we have a critical mass so that we're not just a few chosen people who get an opportunity, but that we are creating our own industry and our own critical mass? This is me. I had the bright idea. I woke up one day and I wrote it down. And then I headed off to find partners. And the partners turned out to be Emily Carr University. And then I applied to the Western Diversification, and we're growing the partnerships. We're looking beyond any institutions. We're always looking for new ways to create relationships. We've held 2 workshops so far, well, actually 3. We had a little mini one. It was an introduction to Unity. And then this summer we had 2 workshops. We are lucky we have this wonderful woman named Moni Gar, who is a Mohawk woman who is a software architect who works with big companies and does all kinds of programming in her money-making life, but at home, what she does is she works on language, Mohawk language, VR projects working with Oculus. She's an amazing teacher, and she came out and taught 2 workshops and then worked with C-Swice and Jury Manual to help them develop their own VR projects. We're not working at the level of commissioned artwork, where you're looking at much higher end programmers, much higher end equipment, much higher end facilities and opportunities. We're basically making best of what we have. And I think that we're doing pretty good. So far, we've probably brought in about 20 people. And the idea is that we will continue to grow the circle. So those 20 people will bring in another 20 people, and then those 20 people will bring in another 20 people, and then so forth. So here's some of our purpose. And by the way, that's Tia Terrer, who's a filmmaker and an editor who's worked with Caroline increase the economic and innovative potential of Indigenous media producers, their hands-on experience, encourage and support Indigenous entrepreneurial initiatives. Certainly we have to find ways to be able to monetize what we do. Engage with Indigenous communities and organizations to use VR for economic, educational, cultural, and health benefits. So we don't want to just be confined to art-based work, although art-based work should be informing all this work. But just as VR right now is being very driven by health and by economic development and training, I think that's something that we want to really participate in, and particularly around language, which I know people at Caroline and Moni are engaged with. We also partnered recently with the First Peoples, well, I want to say Congress, but Council in Victoria. And the Victoria workshop we did, we invited many of their workers, the staff, to see what use VR could be with their language training. Increase the visibility and integration of Indigenous perspectives, cultural practices, and values in the mainstream VR and digital media industry, and promote and develop self-sustaining Indigenous media production centers. We have a series of workshops that we're offering, and we have in the next year we'll be having 6 workshops between January and March, and they will all be sort of hands-on VR based, and they will be laddered so people can take the next step up. And those are kind of some of our eventual matrix, our outcomes. And I guess, like I say, we're looking for partners. But one of the things I wanted to kind of go further on is this idea of, so what is this? So yes, we can create economy, we can get hired, we can get more people programming, we can get more people producing VR, we can work with Indigenous communities who have educational training for a language that would be a useful tool. We can also do, training in remote areas for people who, don't want to have to come to town to do all the training because it's very onerous. I have relatives who live up north, and it takes them like 2 days to get to Vancouver, and then they have to go back. It's 2 days, it's 4 days just to come to a 2-day workshop in Vancouver. So is it possible that can we, be delivering more training and programming that meets the practical needs of our communities? But I think the other thing is, to go back to Leroy, is this idea of rewiring the brain. One of the things we talk a lot about is trauma. The thing about Weimar, Germany, and the trauma of the loss of meaning. And this idea of how language can rewire the brain, and how can actually kind of create cognitive changes. And if you've experienced trauma, then perhaps VR has a role to play in that. To again, go back to the Wired magazine, and the latest Wired magazine, there was an article about Tetris. And the guy who created Tetris is back again. And now it's like super Tetris. And you can even go and experience it in VR. But what's happened, and he's made it a very almost hypnotic experience, but there's been a lot of cognitive research around people who play Tetris. And they have found that people who play Tetris are able to not forget trauma, but that trauma becomes differently programmed in the brain. And it's not just Tetris. I'm sure there are other things. Ceremony does the same thing. Ceremony has a way of creating symmetry, creating harmony, and it creates cognitive changes in the brain. So it's not Tetris per se, although Tetris is doing it. Is that possible? And I think that's ultimately our goal. How many of you saw Arrival? Arrival, I said, oh, fuck, they stole our idea again. We were saying that, just go learn the Indigenous language and then you'll change your minds. So you will become, you will be able to transcend time and space. You will now be able to live more wholly and in the moment. But nonetheless, it was a beautiful film. And it basically, that was at the core of Arrival. So with IM4, as much as we're looking for practical economic development, we're looking to be able to participate. C-Swice, I have C-Swice experimental first effort at VR here. If we can watch, I can show you the video, but might have time for some people to actually see it on Oculus Go. How can she rewire her own life experience in terms of her knowledge, in terms of her sense of self? She comes from Squamish, and she said I can say all this. She comes from Squamish, and her family about 3 generations ago has Hawaiian blood, because Hawaiians came over on the boats, working on the boats, and they married into the Nahanni family. So there's a large group of Nahannis, I think 700. Her mom, Barb Weiss, said last time I was talking to her mom, 700 Nahannis who came from that, 3 or 4 generations ago, intermarriage between a Hawaiian and a Squamish woman. So Cease and her mother have kept that Hawaiian connection alive, and Cease has reached out to that Hawaiian connection and went to Hawaii and found the relatives of those 3 or 4 generations ago families, and so she wanted to go and experience what that meant. And could she, without using the word, cognitively change who she is in terms of her understanding herself as a Squamish and a Hawaiian matriarch? And how does she do that? And what role does VR play in that? It doesn't replace ceremony. It doesn't replace the experience, but it becomes like the Tetris. It becomes like, this new language that allows her to experience things at a deeper level. I'm going to show you a little bit, and then we'll see it in the Oculus, if you can, because we had trouble with it earlier. And by the way, Moni Gar very kindly arranged for Cease to get this Oculus Go from Oculus, which is wonderful, because so far we haven't been able to manage that ourselves within the funding agency's thing that we got going.
Higunu uspagan we aswuna gawimam skutaman. These are the pipe laws that I will.
I was just remembering the pipe laws. So here is. This is the woman who's taking Cease in her arms. Oh.
The weird glitch sometimes with YouTube.
Where did that get? I'm going to just close.
You're occasionally getting it peeking out on the side there, and then it bounces back.
Well, my screen is showing fine.
Yeah.
So
The neighbor just like,
can you?
ITG YouTube.
But it's now disappeared from my screen. That's all right. Since it's now disappeared, from my screen. I can't.
We could just hit space, maybe. Where'd that cursor go?
I have a weird cursor. Let me just go back into her downloads. 3D one, isn't it? Now that it's can't see it, it's on the screen. It's not on the screen. Okay, I'm gonna stop it all. I'm going to.
Change the slice to mirror, then yeah, that was the problem.
Just a minute.
I can just change the mirror.
Okay. Now keep in mind this was done on a $400 Samsung 360 camera. It's her very first VR that she did. It's really more 360, part of an installation. And again, like I say, she's finding this relationship with her. she's always been, she's an ethnobotanist. I think many of you must know of her. She does workshops in, plants and traditional foods from this area. And she, I guess what you call earth artist. And she, her ultimate goal with her VR is to create a VR forest, which would be what she would hope it would be for her community first, so that people would be able to experience the plants and the knowledge that she's acquired over the years.
And she did the same process. And then she inspired me to do it because she asked me to help her to make the drum after the fact. They did this process and they squeezed it out and put it on the frame. And then they brought me up to her house. Soon this freshly came out of the smokehouse. And then we started making the drum. So I taught her how to do that part, and then I was asking her, well, how did you do it from square one? And so I just did, and I just kept asking around, asking the hunters, and asking my cousins.
Is that a heron?
Herring?
Yeah.
Blue herring?
But
Blue heron? Came down to see what we were doing down there by the river.
Yeah.
All the black.
So there's, and like I say, I'll be able to, few people will be able to watch this. You can put the lights back on. There's a few other things she has, but Weiss, W-Y-S-S. So I don't really have any more following up questions or answers. I do believe that I have said this before, so I think it's fair to say it again, that we are inheritors of great cultural knowledge, and we have a great deal of responsibility to that knowledge. And when these new technologies come into play, it's critical for us to, just as in the old days when a sewing machine or a telephone or a car came into communities, people would sit down and talk about what are these, what should we call them, what words should we apply to them, how should they be, serve a purpose in our communities. They weren't just seen as consumer goods. They weren't just seen as something that's going to make people's lives easier. They were ones that were actually going to problematize life. They were going to make things different. And so how were they going to be incorporated? And it was a collective discussion. It wasn't just, someone says, oh, I'm going to make up a word now for this thing. It was like, it was a group of people gathering together to actually come up with what that word thing would be. And so in the word, it would also signify the meaning and the purpose of that. And I wish I could remember some of them right now, but there's words for television, there's words for, there's words for sewing machines, there's all kinds of words in Cree for those words. I imagine they would also be in Haisla and, other languages as well. There's those kind of ways of, so is there a word that we would change for virtuality? I don't know yet. We haven't come up with one, but it certainly is something that we feel strongly that it's important that we start this process and that we create a critical mass and that as many people as possible can participate in this. It's still a fledgling, we're still ironing out a lot of sort of institutional issues, but nonetheless we hope to be operational in January to March, and then hopefully we'll be able to go to the next level and other scales. So great. I don't think I have much else to say, so thank you.